We are entering the home stretch, and I would like to introduce the person who is going to introduce the final two people. Adam DeFalla, who has a McGill connection. He has been teaching in the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. He is a journalist. He's a communications specialist. He comes from the conservative tint of the political spectrum. That will not surprise you. And Adam is going to be teaching in our new MPP program. I talked about how policies and the policy process is complex and how there are many complexities. Well, one of the complexities in the policy process and in the policy world is communication. And Adam is going to be teaching a course about how to communicate policy and how communications is important for getting good policies through, and how maybe even it helps you get bad policies through, and how the lack of communication will stand in the way of getting policies through. So without further ado, Adam, I'm going to ask you to introduce our next two guests. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks very much, Chris. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I want to say to Tom Velk a couple of words. Tom, thank you for all that you've done over the years in shepherding North American studies, for giving me the chance to teach at this university. Some of my fondest memories, some of my most memorable times of the last several years have been at McGill teaching in your program, and I'm glad that we're commemorating you today in this way. And what a better way to finish it than with what's coming up next. So I'm very honored to be introducing our next two speakers. And I'm doing it with a great deal of humility and a little bit of nervosity, I have to admit, because I've really looked up to both the host of our upcoming chat and the subject of the chat for many years, and I'm truly privileged to be able to introduce them today. First, our host, the Honourable Linda Frum. Linda Frum was appointed to the Senate of Canada in 2009 by Prime Minister Stephen Harper, representing the province of Ontario. A fierce advocate for human rights in Iran, Senator Frum has co-sponsored Iran Accountability Week on Parliament Hill. She is also known for her legislative efforts to eliminate foreign funding in Canadian elections, an important topic that only recently has started getting the attention it deserves. Senator Frum currently serves as the Vice Chair of the Board of Directors for the United Jewish Appeal of Greater Toronto and serves on the board of the United Israel Appeal. She is a member of the International Auschwitz-Birkenau Foundation Committee, and she is a recipient of many awards, including an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters from Yeshiva University, and in June 2019, she will be awarded an honorary degree from Hebrew University. Now, many of you know Senator Frum as a journalist and as an author. She comes from a great family of journalists and reporters. She's been a columnist with the National Post. She's been a contributing editor to Maclean's, and she's a Gemini Award-winning documentarian. What you may not know is that Linda is a proud graduate of McGill's North American Studies program. And she's also a very generous and fiercely loyal friend and a most dedicated alumnus of the NAST program. And now her guest. Born and raised in the small town of Baie-Comeau on Quebec's North Shore, Brian Mulroney first got involved in politics in 1956 when, as a teenager, he joined the Youth for John Diefenbaker Committee. After graduating from St. Francis Xavier and Laval University Law School, Brian Mulroney worked as a lawyer. After an unsuccessful bid for the leadership of the PC Party in 1976, he went on to lead the Iron Ore Company of Canada here in Montreal, before eventually winning the leadership of the Conservative Party in 1983. In September 1984, Mr. Mulroney led the PC Party to its greatest parliamentary victory in Canadian history and became the 18th Prime Minister of Canada. 4 years later, he was re-elected with another majority government, thus becoming the first Prime Minister in 35 years to get 2 straight majority governments and the first Conservative Prime Minister to accomplish that feat in 100 years. He stepped down in June 1993 after leading the government for more than 9 years. Brian Mulroney's government was an activist government and led such important initiatives as the Free Trade Agreement with the United States, cleaning up Canada's public finances, a number of important privatizations, anti-inflationist monetary policy, deregulation, and reduced spending at the federal level, all policies that still form the bedrock of Canadian public policy at the federal level today. In the realm of foreign affairs, Brian Mulroney gave us a record of which Canada can be proud. His vocal advocacy for sanctions against the evil apartheid regime in South Africa and his support for Nelson Mandela put him at odds with our key allies. Canada strongly supported the liberation of Kuwait and was by America's side in the 1991 Gulf War. He was an early champion of the concept of humanitarian intervention when Canadian troops were sent to the Balkans in 1990. Let us also celebrate his environmental achievements: the Acid Rain Treaty, 8 new national parks, and the Environmental Protection Act. For these accomplishments and more, in 2006, he was voted Canada's greenest Prime Minister. Since leaving office in 1993, Mr. Mulroney has focused on his business career, returning to the practice of law, sitting on a variety of corporate boards, and, it must be noted, still devoting time to public service as an informal advisor to key figures in government. The fact that he recently celebrated his 80th birthday makes all this all the more remarkable. When you boil it right down, history has given us 2 kinds of political leaders. First, there are the managers, those who seek public office mainly because they want to hold power. For them, running government is an end in itself. Then there are the conviction politicians, men and women who get into public life and use power to push big transformational ideas and to make lasting change. By any measure, Brian Mulroney falls squarely into that second group. Mr. Mulroney has been out of office for more than 25 years. We now have the ability to examine his record with the benefit of hindsight. The ideas he championed and the causes he pushed were ahead of their time and have now withstood the test of time. In fact, many of them are directly responsible for the prosperity we enjoy today. Brian Mulroney showed us the power of ideas and the consequences they can have in the best way possible, by leading by example. We look forward to hearing your views today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Senator Linda Frum and the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney.
So, Adam, thank you so much. That was really generous and appreciated. I'm sure I can speak for both of us on that.
Could have made it longer.
Speaking for myself, it is a huge honor to be part of this tribute and afternoon of appreciation for Professor Velk. And given what a giant of academia it is so fitting to have a titan of Canadian politics here to mark this occasion of your retirement. It is a tremendous compliment to Professor Velk, Prime Minister, that you are here on this occasion. And as Adam mentioned, I am a graduate of North American Studies. And in fact, Professor Velk was my advisor and had a tremendous influence on me. And I graduated, I suppose it was this time of year, in 1984. And I moved from Montreal to Ottawa so that I could intern at the party headquarters of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada and work to help see then Mr. Mulroney elected as Prime Minister. So I stayed there until you did that in September of 1984 with the biggest majority ever, or the biggest popular vote ever, and a record that stands to this day. And so for me, this is a very nostalgic moment for me, but it's an incredible honor to be here with two people who had such an influence, not only in my young life, but I'm sure in the lives of many in this room. And so today, seeing as we are having this conversation in your honor, Tom, I'm going to ask the Prime Minister to focus on 4 topics. We have about 40 minutes or so. We'll speak about NAFTA and trade, Canada and the broader world, populism and regionalism, and civics and liberal education. But before we dive into the political policy stuff, may I ask you, can McGill survive the retirement of Tom Velk?
I'm going to have to think about that one for a long time. But let me just say that how pleased I am to be here because it's a celebration of, in many ways, of Tom's contribution not only to McGill, which is a great institution on its own, but the enhancement of that reputation that came from Tom's leadership of the Institute over all those years, making it so respected and influential in not only universities, but governments of all stripes across the country. I was down at Rice University the other day at the Baker Institute to receive their leadership award down there. And the president of the university raised McGill and he said, "Do you know Tom Velk?" I said, "What about me?" "Yes, I know Tom Velk. Why do you ask?" "Well, our Canadian information and appreciation of Canadian politics comes from his institute." And so I said, "Well, I hope he's charging you guys for it." But that's the way his reputation has gone, higher and higher across Canada and the United States. And congratulations, Tom, on an absolutely superb contribution, both to the university and to Canada.
Okay, well, speaking of superb contributions, Prime Minister, one of your crowning achievements as Prime Minister is that you were the force behind the original free trade agreement with the United States and then later negotiating NAFTA. In fact, you staked the 1988 election on fighting for free trade with the United States. And you spent a lot of time in that election persuading Canadians about the value of an economic trading bloc. And I'm wondering if you can explain, particularly for the students in the crowd, how controversial and contentious an issue it was in free trade was. And now we take it for granted that it's something that we need to have. But can you talk about how it was then?
It's almost hard to remember, you know, when you think of it, and you saw the way other things just go through like that, because people are used to it now. This one historian has written that this was the most brutal election campaign in Canadian history. And having played a role in it, I can assure you that was true. we brought in the Canada-United Free Trade Agreement. The Liberals, the NDP, the media, most of the left-wingers in Canada and at the University of Toronto in particular, you can always figure things out. I always knew that when McGill said something, it was generally right. When the University of Toronto said something, it was generally wrong. So I would say to the cabinet, just follow McGill. To hell with the U of T, as good as it is. And we had the position of the official opposition in the House of Commons when John Turner was the leader. But the international trade representative was Roy McLaren, who said, "We shall blame every sparrow that falls on free trade." That's the kind of reception I got. So you can imagine this was not a happy campaign. It was tough and brutal, but we won, and the opposition said that Canada was going to lose its shirt. That Mulroney loved the Americans so much that what he really wanted was to become governor of the 51st state. Well, what the hell, eh? It's a job, And this, of course, was crazy stuff. I was accused of selling out my own country, of being disloyal. I mean, it was just unbelievable and appalling. So what happened after all of this? They said we were going to lose our languages, we were going to lose our Medicare, we were going to lose our old age pensions, you name it, it was gone. Well, here we are, say 25 years later, or thereabouts. What has happened? Well, what happened with the Free Trade Agreement, which was the foundational instrument for NAFTA, what happened with the Free Trade Agreement is that Canada and the United States developed the largest bilateral commerce between any two nations in the history of the world. Millions of new jobs were created. And Canada sold its value-added products, not just oil and gas and agricultural products, into the United States. And we developed a sophistication and a skill in this that has served us well as the years have gone by. It took Canada 125 years to develop a GDP of $800 billion. Under free trade, it took 25 years to double that. And the interesting thing is that we didn't lose a thing. We still have our languages, I think. We've got our Medicare. We've got our water. Oh, that was another one. Mulroney's going to sell our water to. We didn't lose a thing. So what does this added GDP do? It strengthens our balance sheet, and because it strengthens our balance sheet, it strengthens our sovereignty. The only way that America leads the world is because of the strength of its balance sheet. That's where American strength comes from, not its policies. It can enact the policies because of the strength of its economy. And we did the same thing with Canada. By doubling, and we're on our way to tripling the size of our economy in a brief period of time, we have more money for hospitals, more money for universities and education, more money for our military requirements, more, you name it. So we can strengthen our sovereignty, and that's exactly what we did. So the Free Trade Agreement was an historic event in Canada's life. It was a tough election. And we now have the results. And we then went on 5 years later. That was with President Reagan. And then I went on with President Bush and President Salinas of Mexico. And we extended this and expanded it to Mexico. And just very briefly, the results, you heard President Trump running around saying that NAFTA was the worst thing in the history of the world, and it cost America everything, and so on, which of course is on a par with many other things that are said there, like zero. So what's NAFTA today? Well, NAFTA is a grouping of 3 friendly countries with a population of 500 million people, who with 7% of the world's population last year generated 29% of the world's wealth. And we have a 1.2 trillion three-way commerce between us as a result of that. And 55 million, let me try that again, 55 million new jobs have been created in Canada, Mexico, and the United States since I signed that document in San Antonio, Texas, with George Bush, and yet you have people saying, boy, there Mulroney did it again. He sold us out again. Some people can't stand prosperity, but that's what it was, and that's what happened.
So, Prime Minister, can I ask?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so you were, of course, an advisor on this latest round. We'll call it NAFTA 2.0, because we don't know what else to call it, or we do, but
Yeah.
It's confusing. Can you tell us, in your role as an advisor, can you give us any kind of insider's view about what happened during the negotiations? And can you tell us, in terms of the advice that you gave or the contributions that you feel you made in this latest round, is there something that you're particularly proud of, or some piece of wisdom that you gave them that you think helped?
Well, I got a call from the Prime Minister asking me if I would provide him and his cabinet with some counsel with regard to the renegotiation of NAFTA. And he then invited me to a cabinet meeting. And I walked in there. It was the first time in Canadian history that a Conservative Prime Minister has attended a Liberal cabinet meeting. And it was the same old cabinet chamber I had, you know, the big oval table and so on. In fact, Linda, I walk in, I had no clue who most of these ministers were. And I shook hands with them around the table, and I sat down. And right up against the wall was where the confidential note takers for cabinet sit. And so I sat down. The cabinet ministers are looking at me as if I'm from Mars. Here's this relic who's appeared from the past. And they're looking at me, not too sure what the hell I'm doing there. And I sat down, I looked at the wall where the note taker, and I said, hey, who took my picture off the wall? And it started, not me, Prime Minister, not me. I finally had to say, don't worry, it wasn't there in the first place. But no, we had a very good conversation, and I had many meetings with the Prime Minister and his advisors at their request to help guide them through. I had done this in the original free trade agreement, then I did it again in the NAFTA one, so I had some idea of what was cooking. And also, American negotiating tactics. I want to tell you, this is something to behold. I always remember, in fact, Jim Baker was a fantastic guy. He was Reagan's chief of staff, and then he was Reagan's Secretary of the Treasury, and then he was Bush's Secretary of State. Probably the greatest public servant that America has produced in the last 75 years. Anyway, he was brought in at the crunch time. Simon Reisman, I had appointed Simon Reisman, a great guy, with the McGill connection, by the way. Simon was outstanding. And I appointed him ambassador and in charge of the negotiations. And finally, things weren't happening. We were running out of time because the Americans operate under a clause which allows them to negotiate a comprehensive agreement within a certain period of time. And if it's done, the House and the Senate have to vote on it, yay or nay. They can't cherry pick They can't take anything off the table. So that's important for us. So we were running out of time, and we only had a couple of days left. And I called my team back, and Reagan called me. And he said, well, what's going on? What the hell has happened here? I said, Ron, what's happened is there's no bloody progress being made. You guys are not taking this seriously. Your guys are not taking it seriously. Well, he said, what do I do? What do you think I should do? I said, I think you should change your bloody chief negotiator. You get Jim Baker in there, some guy with authority and knowledge, and we can work well with him. Yeah, I think we'll get it done. He appointed Baker. And on the last night, fast-track authority is going to expire at midnight, what I told you about. And here it's about 9:30 or 10 o'clock. And Baker calls me. So I've got our team, Simon Reisman, Derek Burney, Alan Gottlieb. I've got our team, 8 of them, in the Treasury building down there in the boardroom, a Saturday night. And Baker calls me and he says, Prime Minister, look, I think I've got good news for you. And I said, what's that? And he said, we got pretty well everything you want, everything you need. But there's one thing that I can't deliver, and that's the independent dispute settlement mechanism. And I said, Jim, look, you know this is a showstopper with me. If I don't, I told you from the beginning, and I told Ron from the beginning, if Canada doesn't get an independent dispute settlement mechanism, we're out of here. Because you guys have got an economy 10 times the size of ours, and I don't want Canadians hauled down before American courts to be crushed under your system. What we need is an impartial system. You appoint a judge, I appoint a judge, the 2 judges get together and appoint a Spaniard or a Brit or somebody, and it's fair and impartial. Well, he said, that's a surrender of our sovereignty and we can't do it. I said, okay, Jim, then I only have one thing to tell you. It's Saturday night, Reagan is at Camp David, and I'm going to call him right now. And I have one question for him. Now, I should tell you, that because Baker was chief of staff, he knew my relationship with Reagan. He used to say, he and Colin Powell, Jesus, we got to keep Mulroney away from the old man, because they're both Irish. And Reagan will give him the dome off the Capitol. And Mulroney's not shy about asking for it. So we got to be careful here. And he knew, Jim knew this. So I said, I'm going to call him right now. And he said, and I have one question. He said, what's that? I said, I'm going to say, Ron, why is it that you have been able to negotiate a nuclear reduction pact with your worst enemy, the Soviet Union, and you can't negotiate a free trade agreement with your best friends, the Canadians? Total silence. Baker says, Prime Minister, can you give me 20 minutes? I said, sure. Now, what I'm about to tell you, I didn't see or hear, because it took place in Washington, is that 20 minutes later, Baker walks in to the boardroom where the 8 Canadians are, and he has a piece of handwritten paper, and he throws it on the table, and he says, there's your goddamned independent dispute settlement mechanism. Now, can we get this up to the Capitol before midnight, before we lose fast-track authority? So when I told the story to Justin, he said, well, because he's a lot more polite than I am, and he said, well, you think that's going to happen? I said, you can count on it. You keep your eye open. And he said, what do you think? And I said, I think what I told your cabinet with regard to what's going on with the negotiations, so-called negotiations with President Trump. You keep your head down, you keep your mouth shut, and you never, ever, ever respond to any of his tweets or comments of any kind. And eventually, in the end, you're going to see through a lot of things. Well, lo and behold, at the last moments, it was a replay of what I just told you. And Justin did exactly the right thing. he really told the president to go fly a kite. And he said to me, he said, do you think that this will be the end? I said, no. The end is going to be at NAFTA 2, as you say, Linda, NAFTA 2, signed and delivered. It's going to go to, well, he says he's going to cancel it. He says you can't listen to a thing he says.
So that brings us to the present moment. And can you tell us, because as it stands now, it's not signed. We're going to have an election in Canada in 6 months or less, maybe. You know, it hasn't passed through Congress and it's stalled. Do you think it will be ratified? And if it's not, does that matter?
I think it will be ratified by Mexico, Canada, and the United States, but not in the immediate future. There's just too much going on down there involving the president and his allies, and a lot of trouble in River City down there. And but it's going to be signed, it's going to be approved, and it's going to come into effect. It is NAFTA is the largest, most dynamic, and richest free trade area in the history of the world. Of course, they're going to go for it. It means millions and millions of jobs in the U.S., Mexico, and Canada.
How about Canada and our trading relationship with China? It was discussed here on an earlier panel. We learned about Section 3210. Part of this deal, as it stands now, is that we are not supposed to engage in trade negotiations with non-market economies unless we have the consent of the United States. So, from an American-Canadian relationship point of view, and from a Canadian perspective, should we be pursuing trade with China?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I did a deal with Reagan on the Northwest Passage. They used to sail their ships right through our northern waters without a by your leave. And the deal I made with them was, you cannot send any American ships on there unless you have my permission. But I will not unreasonably withhold that permission. But at least it was an assertion of our sovereignty over our own northern waters and the Arctic.
There's the unreasonably withheld.
Yeah, that's right. Now this is the same thing with, I wouldn't pay any attention to that clause in NAFTA. I think Canada has a more, I don't know what happened in the panel with the experts on China, and I'm not an expert on it, but Canada's up a tree. We're up a tree big time with China. And we're having trouble in the United States. But China, the way they've been treating Canada, is simply unacceptable. But you can't solve this by sending an assistant deputy minister over to China. I think we should get somebody, a former prime minister like Chrétien, who had a good relationship over there, and his son-in-law, Andy Desmarais, who is the best connected guy in China, in North America, with the possible exception of Henry Kissinger. I'm telling you, Andy Desmarais knows every single soul of importance there. And Jean is a former prime minister, and so he could play a very important role by going over, look, it's an old boys club or an old girls club, whatever you want. You go over, if you served with the president of China, as I have, and as he has, or you served with the president of the United States, well, you go and see them for brunch or breakfast, what have you. Say, hey, Donald, look, Canada has a hell of a problem. We can't go through normal channels. You can't have Trudeau come down here and be fighting on your front lawn. Why don't you do this? Why don't we solve it this way? I think somebody like Chrétien, complimented, I should say, by his son-in-law, Andy, could see the president of China and the prime minister and say, hey, what the hell is going on? We've had a great relationship, and all of a sudden, we had to pick up a girl in Vancouver. We had to arrest her because under our terms, our extradition treaty with the United States, we had to do it. And so it's not that we went out to hunt her down, and you're holding this against us. You're starting to cut off all our farmers. This is a big deal that's going on. And we can't get to first base. We fired the ambassador, our ambassador, over there. And it's a hell of a mess. And the Chinese, in my experience with them, which was long, the Chinese are very orderly in the conduct of foreign affairs, very orderly. And they got long memories. So I believe that this is being mishandled by the federal government. And I don't mean that in a critical way. It's just an observation, because my suggestion, I think, is not without merit. If they did this privately, you don't announce the prime minister's coming and his son-in-law or what have you. You just go over there and you call up your friend and say, Mr. Charlie, I'm coming to see you. And you get over there and he says, Chrétien says, listen, I just came from a meeting with the Prime Minister of Canada. Here's what we're ready to do. We got to solve this. We got to get this off the front burner, because it's damaging Canada and it's damaging you. Because I always used to tell them, you guys have a problem. The world thinks that Canada is a wonderful, moderate, reasonable country. They have not the Prime Minister is not like that, but the country is. So if you can't get along with Canada, you've got a problem, not me. And there's a lot of that at the United Nations and elsewhere. The Chinese are trying to make a major breakthrough into Latin America and to Africa. And Canada is on the back burner everywhere. And we better get with the program.
Okay, so let's move. So you talked about Canada being up a tree with China. Another difficult situation we have right now is with Saudi Arabia. And I want to ask you this question in the context of another one of the major accomplishments of your prime ministership. You led the campaign of sanctions against South Africa, economic and political sanctions, because you wanted to end the apartheid regime. And you did that by forming an alliance and really using political and economic force. But we have a situation right now between Canada and Saudi Arabia where you have a $15 billion arms deal that was approved by both the Harper and the Trudeau government. So this is not a partisan issue. But in order to, because that deal is so important to our country, you have a situation like we had just the other day, where when the Saudis behead and 37 civilians and put their heads on sticks, we have our foreign minister saying that she's concerned about that, but there's not the same willingness to denounce and condemn that you showed, let's say, in the case of South Africa. So, can you tell us? How do you think Canada should be handling that situation?
I think Canada should be defending its values and its rights openly and publicly. You don't have to offend people by the way in which you do it, but by taking a reasonable position. And this $15 billion contract out in London, it's only money. It's only money. We have a lot more than money at stake here. We have our reputation and our achievements for over 150 years as a strong, effective country. And while I wouldn't like to lose that contract, I'd much rather lose the contract than lose our principles.
But you are somebody who understands the political consequences. I mean, we've had a whole scandal in the last few months over the idea of losing jobs. That's the theory anyhow.
I think the scandal was not over losing jobs. The scandal was nobody did anything wrong that I can see in this thing. There was no wrongdoing committed. They bungled the communications completely so that everybody thought somebody had done something wrong. And it was a mess. And
but to go back to the Saudi story, so that you feel like your political advice would be that it's okay that Canada could potentially walk away from that relationship with the Saudis on principle.
Absolutely. We got I knew his grandfather, Abdullah, the present prince who's running the shop there. I knew his grandfather, and used to go and see him too in Riyadh. he was always very accommodating, very reasonable for Canada. In fact, if you'll check with Prime Minister Harper, he asked me to speak to the King when I was going over there about getting him to Canada for the G20. First time he ever left Saudi Arabia, I think, in his life, except to go to the Mediterranean. But they loved Canada. They had a lot of dealings with Canada. I think that my good friend, the Minister of Foreign Affairs there, she was a little flippant in her, you don't do foreign policy by tweet. And she irritated a hell of a lot of people with some of these flippant comments that she made, that she didn't have to make. She's too smart to not know that. But it happened, and they chose to express irritation about this. But it's pretty hard, I think, that for a leader, one of whose citizens, a journalist from the Washington Post, is murdered and eviscerated in their consul general in Turkey. Pretty hard to express indignation about the conduct of somebody else. So I would say that the Saudis they're at a weak point now. They're not in a strong position. Look, if the prince tried to come here on a state visit or to Washington or to New York, there'd be riots in the streets everywhere. And so they're not in a strong position. Canada is in a strong position. But we've got to assert our leadership and be proud of our country and speak out about it. And, leadership requires, Bill Clinton used to say, leadership is the capacity to look around the corner of history just a little bit. Well, if you look around the corner of history, what do you see? Well, you've got to see the challenges we have at home. We can't move a barrel of oil. We got 175 billion barrels of oil in the ground that could make us all rich forever. We can't move anything. They say it's because it's the environmentalists and the Aboriginals. That's nonsense. I've done many deals with the Aboriginals and the environmentalists and the provinces. But it requires leadership. And that's the commodity, and I'm not speaking of any political party. I'm just saying in general. Look, the reason that politicians are so reluctant to take major steps is because Canada is profoundly resistant to change. And every time you propose change, people get mad at you. And you lose your popularity. And the politicians don't like being unpopular. I finally figured out that you can be either popular, which I was. I won the biggest majorities in history on an ongoing basis. So I was popular. And you know what happened when I finally figured out? When I was popular as hell. I figured, why am I so popular? The answer was, I hadn't done a damn thing. I hadn't done a thing. So when I started to do things, free trade, NAFTA, the GST, all of these things, I got more and more and more unpopular. So I said, maybe I should go back to doing nothing. But the problem with that is that one day you retire, and history takes over. And history says, what did that prime minister do? He was there for 10 years. What the hell did he do? The answer is nothing. So he played a great game of golf during the years he was there. But when you leave and you have to live with this in history, and there's nothing that you can point to as what we call big ticket items in history, nothing, you got a problem. You have to live with that for the rest of your life and into history. So I figured, well, I've done all of this and I've become very unpopular. So if I do this, I'll be even more unpopular. And I was.
Prime Minister,
And excuse me, and guess what? the smartest thing I ever did. Because if you think you can accomplish anything, I told Justin, stay out of the goddamn magazines. Stay off the cover of Vanity Fair and all this trash. Do something. I mean, he's a talented, wonderful young man. He should do something. Well, he's, you know, and I understand. I was like that once myself. You know, thank God I broke that habit. Sorry, Linda.
No, not at all. One of the big ticket items, you mentioned that, in your leadership years, was national unity and keeping the country together. People say here we are in 2019, and the country is more divided than ever, and that there's now the renewed fear of separatist movements out west. Can you tell us about your sense of the state of the union and the state of unity in this country, and how concerned are you?
Well, there are two major files that a prime minister has on his desk at all times: national unity and Canada-U.S. relations. This is what he's got to handle himself. He can't pass it off to somebody else. I think that the unity situation, relative to what we've known over many years, is pretty good. Pretty good today. I don't put much stock in, Linda, in Western separatism. And, you know, look, Jason Kenney is, he's got a problem. He says that he's being screwed by Trudeau and the eastern provinces and so on. And that he wants pipelines that go east, west, and south. And so Trudeau's answer is going to be, and he's threatening all of these things from Alberta. And Trudeau's answer will probably be, well, Premier Kenney, you were a member of Prime Minister Harper's government for 10 years. You never laid a foot of pipe, not a foot of pipe, east, west, or south. Why are you blaming poor old me, little Trudeau? I'm trying to do it. And that's because there has been no leadership nationally, and there's no leadership from the provinces. Somebody has to take the national view. And look, it's kind of like there's, on this, if I may, Linda, it's kind of like the free trade thing. I mean, I've tried to describe to the younger people how awful it was. I didn't even come close. It was a nightmare. I mean, every bloody night I'd go to bed and it was calamity on television. And in the morning in the newspapers, we couldn't do anything right. And what it really came down to, and this is the way I would translate it with the pipeline thing, which is the biggest crisis we're going to have in the next year or two, is that the Prime Minister, and I suggested this in the past to some other Prime Ministers that didn't get very far, is you develop a plan for Canada and you call together representatives of the Aboriginals, representatives of the environmentalists, and of the producing provinces. And kind of like what I did in free trade, it's a little different, but, and you call them down to Ottawa, and you say, the Prime Minister says, look, we've got this extraordinary asset that's going to make every man, woman, and child in Canada rich forever. And it's going to make us a better and a stronger country. Now, I'm the Prime Minister of Canada, and I've got a vision for my country. So with regard to, I'm going to do this. And the results, with the results, here's what we're going to do for the Aboriginals. And here's what we're going to do for the environmentalists, for you. And here is what we are going to do for the producing provinces. And this is what I get as Prime Minister to share with all Canadians. This is a national project and a national dream. So I want you to think about this for a week or 10 days and come on back and see me for dinner. So they come back and see me and they say one of two things. Yeah, that's a good idea. We're going to work on this and we can do that. And your problem is solved. More likely, they come back and they say, thank you, Prime Minister, for your attention and your concern, but we don't like this, and we're not going to do it. Fine, thank you very much. I told you, I am the Prime Minister of Canada. That means all Canadians. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the plug on you people, and I am going to have a general election. And I am going to put my solution in the window, big time. And if I win, there's the deal. If I don't, you'll have to deal with somebody else. But I'll bet you $1 to a donut right now, which is exactly what I told the premiers in the free trade thing. I'll bet you $1 to a donut when I put this to the people of Canada in a 51-day election campaign, I'm going to win big time. Why? Because Canadians love their country, and they know it has to remain prosperous for their children and grandchildren. And this whole oil imbroglio has to do with provincialism. And you can't have this because I want that. And the only people who can decide this in the end are the people of Canada. And so there's nothing outrageous in saying you won't solve it and I can't solve it alone. Well, by God, we're going to go to the people who can, and those we consult in an election campaign. I think that if Trudeau did that, I tell you what, if he did that, or if Scheer did that in a different way, I'll wager you a lot of money that not only does he win, he wins big time. And why? Nothing to do with oil. Nothing to do with what I've just said. They cast me aside like an old sock. It's because he would be perceived and thanked for leadership. They want somebody to say, I was elected, I'm in charge, and here's what I'm going to do for the people of Canada. And so I think that both parties, well, there's a couple others too. I love Elizabeth May, the Green Party, but I don't think she's going to be Prime Minister.
No, probably not.
Not right now.
One last question, Dr. Reagan. So you talked about this living hell and the struggle, and I'm old enough, I remember it very well, and it was really nasty, and there was and you personally were attacked, as you say, constantly on a daily basis. But do you agree with the analysis that we hear all the time these days, that politics has never been more vitriolic, has never been more about personal destruction, has never been meaner? In your historical perspective, with your own experience, is politics nastier today than it used to be? And well, what do you think?
No. This is a piece of cake compared to some of the things that we had to live through. I mean, this was remember, I had the Rat Pack in the House of Commons, cooperating with the CBC. I was telling somebody, they said, what do you miss about not being Prime Minister? I told them the truth, Linda. I miss the adulation.
I get that joke.
All those wonderful editorials every morning, Yeah, look, it was a pretty rough game, about as rough as they come.
So if I just, because you hear often that the reason why the millennial generation doesn't want to enter into political life is because it is so mean and tough. And it is. I mean,
it is,
I go to Ottawa every week. It is tough. It's really mean. But it's become there's like a disengagement by young people for the whole profession, because they just think it's not worth it. So what message do you have about that?
One thing, what we didn't have at the time, which is a big factor, we didn't have the internet, and we didn't have social media and all of this stuff. And so we just had a very limited number of people shooting at us. But they were pretty consistent every day. But so I think that in some ways, Linda, you're probably right, that the bar is now much lower because of the social media. I'm not very technologically sophisticated, but every once in a while I push a button and I see something. And I mean, these comments section, I think it's unbelievable that people would actually get up in the morning and say, who do I hate most today? You know, what can I write that is as mean and bitchy as my neighbor? Because he's my competitor. We didn't have that. And that's a big thing, I think, for people who just look around. But I think that I will say this, it's much worse in the United States than I've ever seen it. I mean, what Trump has done there is really extraordinary. But in Canada, from what I can see anyway, on the top level where you are and Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Scheer and Mr. Singh and Mrs. May, I think that's pretty gentlemanly relative to some of the trash that I had to wade through every day. I mean, you wouldn't believe, and your family couldn't believe they couldn't recognize you. Couldn't recognize you in all of this. So that wasn't very much fun. But it's the price of poker. If you want to be prime minister, or you want to be a cabinet minister, or you want to be a senator, an influential senator, you got to pay for it. And the Canadians take it out of your hide, big time.
But the message, I mean, here we are at McGill, we are speaking to young people. Yeah. The message surely is that you can't let that prevent you from trying to make a difference and to take on roles of leadership. Because we were saying before we came out that you're concerned about the dearth of leadership and that people don't want to step forward. So can we just end on that note of a vote of encouragement about people stepping forward?
Yeah, look, I told Linda earlier that I came across, I was given it a couple of days ago. I'd never seen it before. It was an interview conducted by Linda's mother, Barbara Frum, who was the greatest journalist in Canadian history. And she conducted an interview with me, which I had never seen, 3 or 4 days before the 1988 election, which was the worst election in history. Brutal and raw and mean as you'll ever see. But you'd never have known it by watching this interview. Barbara Frum was brilliant, but she also knew everything and was tough as nails. And yet you could get the sense of the intensity of the campaign and the importance of the campaign. And the, as is said in French here, l'enjeu de la campagne électorale, le vrai enjeu de la campagne électorale. You could get that but also think, hey, this was a pretty civilized thing. You know, and in many ways it was informative, and guess what? In spite of all those things I've told you, Canadians went to the polls. They thought about all of this thing about free trade, or we're all going to become Americans, and I was going to be the governor of the 51st state, and we were going to lose our water, and we were going to lose our Medicare, and we were going to lose our hospital insurance. And they said, this is all nonsense. And they threw it out, and they reelected your humble servant. So there you go. There, why the hell they did that, I don't know. But there it goes, and it was that litmus test that your mother imposed on the CBC is a model for students. And if you want to know what it was really like, go and look at that. And I think you'd find people saying, yeah, it was tough, but it's democracy.
Prime Minister. It's been great having this talk with you. Thank you for the remembrance of my mother, and it's just been an incredible day of nostalgia. And thank you so much for this really fascinating
Well, thank
talk.
you all. Thank you. Get up now.
I don't know about you, but I could sit and listen to this all day. But we have approached our hard stop, and at the Max Bell School of Public Policy, we are nothing if not efficient and disciplined. So we will honor the hard stop. Linda Frum, thank you very much for this conversation. And Mr. Mulroney, thank you. Thank you for your thoughts about the Canada-U.S. relationship and the ins and outs. Thank you for your thoughts on leadership. And frankly, more importantly, thank you for your service to this country. Thank you very much. Let's get Tom up here.